Thank you for joining us for 17th century Dutch pots in Maryland Middens. Dr. Jim Gibb will be our host tonight, or rather our guest speaker. So my name is Allison and I work for St. Mary's County Library.
I'm going to share a screen. Well, good evening. Good to see you guys. Hope the past month has been pleasant, if bizarrely spring-like. Tonight's talk is based on work that I'd actually looked back. I did 30 years ago, but it's still relevant. And like a lot of the talks I give on these Monday nights, there is a publication for it. And if anybody's interested in the nitty-gritty of it, feel free to contact me and I will send you a PDF of the paper. Anyway, I got involved in this work about the time I started working on my doctoral dissertation, because I was going to be using a site excavated next to the one that I worked on, Compton site next to Patuxent Point in southern Calvert County. And the Compton site was dug by another CRM firm. And they identified a bunch of ceramics, which they thought were, and correctly, were Dutch. And so that got me involved with this kind of research. And it was at the same time there was a spike in interest pretty much in the Mid-Atlantic and Mid-Atlantic states amongst archaeologists in things Dutch. So without further ado, just a couple of things that we will, that I will cover. What do these pots look like? How do we know that they are Dutch pots? And I will be giving you, showing you a whole bunch of images of a collection of pottery in the collections of the Albany Institute of History and Art in Albany, New York. And then, where have they been found? I'm not going to talk too much about the various sites where they've been found. St. Mary's City, there's been quite a fair number found. And also some of the other early sites in St. Mary's County. For instance, at the Patuxent River Naval Air Station, at a Panay Sewell site, and some sites in Anne Arundel County, just north of Annapolis. But I'm going to focus on those who were recovered from the Compton site because I know most of it. I know a lot about them. What other objects are we finding with these Dutch pots, and which are Dutch and which are probably of English manufacture? And then really the bottom line to all this, the real question is, what are these Dutch pots doing in our Maryland Middens? Because there are laws that pretty much precluded on here. One of the ways in which we can identify and date Dutch pottery is that there is this tradition of painting called Dutch genre painting. And well, let me just show you some paintings. Lots of still lifes, and you can see this image on the left with the scullery made. This large pot here, a ceramic one. There are a couple of metal ones behind it. And on the right, you can see not a pot, but a roamer, a particular kind of wine glass. The thing about these Dutch paintings from, let's say, 1630s to 1660s, 1670s, I'm not an art historian by any means. They're mostly studio work. And so the painters had these props from daily life, pots, bottles, etc. And so they used them repeatedly in their paintings. So you could look at a series of paintings by someone like Rembrandt, for instance, and recognize the same vessels over and over again. So they're not figments of people's imagination. It's just not the artist painting what he or she thought a pot might look like. They're actual props painted from real life. So here's a close-up of that pot, and we have Dutch pots that look just like this. In this scene here, you could see on the ground in front of this woman, it's probably a colander with these very characteristic horizontal ear-like handles. Here in this rowdy scene, the lower left-hand corner, you see up on the table here, we don't see it in its entirety. It's probably a skillet. And right below it is a cooking pot. And off to the right-hand corner, you see a couple of essentially wine jugs. And you see people having a really good time. A lot of the Dutch genre paintings, what they did was they paint, some are just sort of still lifes, and some are kind of moralistic paintings, where they show you the sins of gluttony and drunkenness and such, and poor hygiene. You know, for instance, there's a couple of paintings showing a maid in an second floor window in perhaps Amsterdam, emptying a chamber pot out onto the street near a passerby. I don't know if this is Bruegel but it's the same sort of stuff. And you can see all kinds of vessels being used. You'd really have to zoom in on them, but you could see a little sort of porringer down here next to the barrel, a ewer, a drinking mug, a bulbous drinking mug. So we get real period illustrations of what these things look like. And here is a classic drinking vessel. We find these on a lot of 17th and early 18th century sites. They usually had a pewter hinged lid on them, which we typically do not find archaeologically. And some of them are even silver. Okay, so let's do some sort of close-up views of what these things look like. The collection I'm going to talk about was collected by or purchased by, I think he was the assistant director of the Albany Institute of History and Art before I came along. He'd retired by the time I became aware of the collection, and I did exchange some correspondence with him. He was very helpful. But what Rod Blackburn did was he purchased, I think, 13 vessels from basically antique dealers, I presume, in the Netherlands. And these are objects that were almost certainly recovered from privy holes by avocational archaeologists. So there are kind of some ethical issues here about purchasing this stuff from looted sites or a museum, and then an academic like me coming along and using this looted material. But what can I say? Here's a sort of a classic skillet, and I'm going to show you two views of it. The top view is kind of interesting. Well, we'll see. I guess in the drawing you'll see some of the characteristics, but it's got this kind of heavy rim about it, and it has what's referred to as a celery stalk handle, because it looks like a stalk of celery. And you can see this vessel has been well used. The interior is all scratched up. And here's a drawing of it, and this is what I meant by the celery stalk handle. So the view of this is from the side and from above. A colander, which I think we saw in one of those genre paintings, got these characteristic ear-shaped horizontal handles. And I think this one was done on a white paste. We're only going to look at form with this collection. I'd like to talk about the paste, the actual ceramic, with some close-up views of it, but the Institute was dead set against me breaking these things up into pieces so I could actually see what the paste looked like. And here's a drawing in profile, and you can see here's those ear-shaped handles, characteristic cordoning or ridging of the side. The holes here are, of course, it's a colander. And a lot of these Dutch pots also have these stumpy little legs on them. No grace to them at all. They're just kind of roughly formed and stuck on the bottom. Not with a colander, of course, but with a lot of the cooking vessels that have those feet. They're really important because these things typically weren't put on open flame. You would create a bed of coals and put the vessel on top of that bed of coals. So you needed those feet to sort of create a space between the coals and the vessel. Also, this is sort of a saucer. It's got these kind of almost leaf-shaped pinched feet, which I haven't seen on any other vessels. And some of them are actually decorated. This is from North Holland. Remember, when we're talking about the Netherlands, a lot of folks refer to Holland. Holland is one of 7 provinces that create the United Provinces. We call the Netherlands. Dutch refers to the culture and the language. But this happens to be from the province of North Holland. And it's got this, pretty nice, I wish I had a color photograph of it. I haven't been able to find it. But a nice floral pattern. Again, those characteristic ear handles. Oops, sorry. These, it keeps getting in my way. And some fairly common ridging you see on the sides of these things. And here's another example of the same kind of vessel. It's a porringer. It's for porridge, where you could cook it, but mostly just heat up porridge and eat directly from it. This is an undecorated example. And these groppen, these cooking pots, characteristic of a city called Bergen op Zoom. And they have these big, thick, rounded vertical ear handles, very characteristic rim and ridging. Again, feet on the bottom because it sits on coals. And a larger example of a groppen. Again, you can see the feet here, big ear handles. And you can see how they're attached to the top. Oops, come on. There we go. We get a variety of sort of individual size bowls and cups, handled bowls. I guess you would call this a handled bowl. But what's characteristic about these is not only that big ear-shaped handle, but the way it's pinched up here. It's a very characteristic way of not only attaching the handle, but probably as a way of holding on to the handle. And you can see it in this drawing here. See how it's pinched at the top? Very characteristic Dutch quality that you don't see on British pottery. And a very simple cup that looks, well, it is very basic, but it also has a characteristic ear-shaped handle. You don't really see the pinching on this one. Just barely make it out. And another porringer. Again, ear-type handle, pronounced ridge around the midline. The glazes aren't particularly characteristic. You see them on British. I think you'd find it hard to distinguish one from the other. Here it is in section. And I suppose you would call this a saucer. It has a barely pinched handle over here, these clumsy feet. It is characteristic mostly because it's so humble, so plain. So the Volkswagen bug of pottery. And a more elaborate type of saucer here, again with pinched handle. It's got sort of a wavy rim to it. It's meant, it's got what you're looking at here in the foreground is a bit of a spout. So it's meant for pouring sauces. And again, the same kind of clunky feet. And the one thing we found a fair amount of at Compton, and I'll show you in a few moments, are these skillets, again with the celery stalk handle, nice pronounced pouring spout, stumpy legs, characteristic rim profile. So again, this would not be put directly on flame, but be put on coals. And what is often referred to in the antiques trade as a chamber, but we would use the full name, which is chamber pot, fittingly at the end of this group of slides. Nice pinched handle, still really big kind of ear-shaped handles. And what's characteristic here is the coordinating, that ridging, which you can see here in profile. And it has sort of a raised central point, which has functional advantages we needn't go into. Okay. So here I'm going to show you the archaeological specimens we got from the Compton site. The Compton site I've talked about before, 17th century site, probably 1650s to 1660s, was located just north of what is now the Naval Rec Center in Calvert County, just across from Patuxent River Naval Air Station. The site was misidentified by the contractors as that of Auguste Lecomte, hence the Compton site. But it's pretty obvious from the description and the land records that they got the wrong one. This site is actually just north of the Compton Lecomte site, and it was patented by William and Magdalene Stevens. Again, probably late 1650s, occupied by their two sons, John and William, as well as themselves, and they had 3 named servants. We do have the gravestone, a ledger stone for Magdalene Stevens, who died, 1673, I think. This is actually over in Cambridge on the Eastern Shore. We know in the early 1660s that the Stevens family packed their bags, and along with a lot of newly minted Quakers, moved over to the Eastern Shore, partly to take advantage of lots of new open land, partly, I suspect, to put some room between themselves and the proprietary Catholic government at St. Mary's City. So we know where they were buried, William and Magdalene Stevens. This ledger stone is in the churchyard, I think at the Episcopal church there, but they were actually, they lived at what is now, I think, University of Maryland land along the river. This is actually from next door at Patuxent Point site, but same basic archaeological equipment used to expose the site once it had been found and sampled. And well, I'll get back to that. This is the footprint. We've got 4 buildings. At least 3 of them have what we call a chimney bay. And that's a small section here, and on number 3 here, and number 4 is over here. That means these 3 structures had wattle and daub chimneys, basket work, woven basket work of sticks plastered with clay. And if they're heated, if they have hearths, they're heated, then we consider them dwellings. We have building number 2 over here, which is small, has no independent heat, whether it's in addition to number 3 or some sort of outbuilding, we don't know. 5 down here is also some small outbuilding, and then we have some sort of pen down here, presumably for livestock. But what's important here for present discussion are these pits, these pit features. These are burrow pits, dug up the silt loam from there, mixed it with water, plastered those basket work hearths, and periodically had to replaster them. So lots of holes, and those holes were used for trash. And from the Dutch end of things, if we found that, there's a lot of British-made stuff as well, and even some French and maybe Spanish, but a whole bunch of Dutch material, including what you've already seen, these skillets, celery stalk handle, characteristic rims, rather thick, kind of round bottom. Of course, we don't have the feet to these. It's got this one, you can see a bit of a spout on it. So we've got a number of these. We've got one of those Grappen cooking pot from Bergen op Zoom, just classic, like I showed you earlier, with the characteristic rim and large vertical ear type handle and clumsy little feet. A plate, and if I recall, this is North Holland slipware, so it actually had a decoration on it. And this is definitely North Holland slipware. It was slip decorated. I'm sorry I don't have illustrations of the decorations. I've got this photograph somewhere, but they were Kodachrome slides I took 30 years ago. So actually a little more than 30. You can, by the way, you can notice there's some dashed lines. These vessels are all they're all broken. So they're all reconstructed on paper. Couple of the folks at CERC, a couple of newcomers a few months ago, got introduced to our operation at Smithsonian by given the task of reconstructing some of the other ceramic pots and plates on paper. They did a miserable job. We moved them onto other things. We've got a picture, which we don't have in the Blackburn collection, but it has the characteristic pinched handle, and the paste is also characteristic of Dutch pots. I'm not going to go into the different redware and whiteware paste. I will say, just sort of brief anecdote, years ago when I worked with Anne Arundel County, the Lost Towns Project, we would periodically get together with some of the other institutions in Virginia and Maryland, folks working on these early colonial sites, and we would get together for the day, talk about what we've been finding, show off stuff. And when we hosted at Anne Arundel, we were passing around some ceramics. And I think somebody, maybe from St. Mary's City, said, well, yeah, I mean, it looks like Midlands yellow from the middle of England. And so what we did was we took a piece of sherd and a magnifier and looked at that paste. And that paste was so sandy, it looked nothing like the British stuff that we were ordinarily finding. So when looking at these vessels, form is important, glaze less so, decoration less so, but the paste, the actual ceramic, looking at that under magnification is really important for distinguishing various types. Can't emphasize that enough. Magnification is really important. So one of the advantages to having been nearsighted my whole life, I early on developed a real appreciation for magnification. We have handled bowl or a porringer with a pinched handle, and just the overall form is pretty typical. I apologize for some of these drawings. They were done a long time ago, and I was never an artist. So these are the other kinds of vessels we were finding at Compton and also at Patuxent Point. On the left, these classic Rhenish blue and gray stoneware mugs, bulbous mug for cider, beer, whatever. A variety of plates and bowls. The lower one being North Devon sand-tempered ware, of which we find much on sites in this area from the 17th century, coming over from the West Country of England. And various sorts of decorated tin glazed earthenwares, mostly what we would call myolica. We have two kinds of tin glazed earthenwares where you use tin oxide to create a glaze to cover nicer ceramics, not generally not chamber pots, but plates and platters, chargers. And they're almost always decorated, painted, usually blue, because other color is burned off at higher temperatures. But the early ones in the 1650s and earlier, to save money on tin, what they would do is they'd use a tin oxide on the front part of the vessel and a mixture of tin and lead on the back, which gave it a really kind of an ugly bluish color. And so a lot of these sherds are actually what we call myolica, which is that mixture of tin and lead on the back and just tin oxide on the front, as opposed to faience, which is the term we use for tin glaze over the entire thing. And it's really difficult to tell whether these are continental or British. We also have some other types, some Santonge, handle from a French vessel. And we get like this piece over in the lower right, the couple of these on the right-hand side, these sgraffito wares. They're from North Devonshire in England. So there's a mixture of types. We don't see 100% Dutch wares on these sites. And so this is the Patuxent Point site. Again, I talked to you about it before. It has two major features from which artifacts were recovered: this large shell-filled pit on the left, and what appears to be a smaller privy towards the center. The Patuxent Point site was occupied just a few years later than Compton, and it has virtually no Dutch ceramic on it. I think Julie King once pointed out to me she found a sherd which she thought was Dutch, but the interesting thing is it was one sherd. I mean, we couldn't even tell the form of the pot. It was just one sherd, and it was pretty badly eroded too. So for some reason, from the 1650s into the 1660s, there's this change where we don't see the Dutch pottery anymore, at least on this. And it's true for sites throughout the area. When we find sites in the 1660s and later, they don't have Dutch material. They don't have Dutch ceramics. Whereas those in the 1640s at St. Mary City and the 1650s do. What we find a lot of around here is this North Devon ceramic, which this is a pipkin. It's looking down on a pipkin. Does not have the celery stalk handle. Has this apple green glaze, and if you looked at it real carefully, you'd see all this coarse sand that tempered the pot. They're kind of ugly looking, but they were quite popular, perhaps because trade networks from this area really focused on the West Country, Bristol, in the 1660s through 1680s. So that's where a lot of the material came from. And so some examples of what that material looks like. They tend to be rather heavy, heavy rims, and all red wares. Some time ago, one of our Monday talks was about the Dove's Nest site near Aquasco in St. Mary's County. Prince George's County, southern Prince George's County. And it was an interesting site because we know it was occupied by this guy named Bernard Johnson, who I learned a couple of years after excavating the site was actually a Dutchman, a carpenter, and he naturalized in the 1670s. And he sought naturalization because technically by law, non-naturalized, non-native Brits and Irish could not own land. So he naturalized and then was able to acquire land. And we'd found his house, again, I talked about this before, a fairly simple earth-fast structure where all of the posts had been replaced at some point. They presumably rotted away. And so new ones replaced the earlier ones. And it had a little cellar hole in the middle. The building had burned down. So that cellar was filled with a number of artifacts that partly melted and warped by the heat. And also a lot of burned daub. There's no chimney bay on this structure, as we saw at Compton and at Patuxent Point. This building almost certainly had a hooded chimney, which is typical of Dutch architecture. It had wattle and daub certainly because it had all these borrow pits just below, but just underneath here, you could see intersecting one another. And a lot of them were filled with burned daub that had clearly been removed from a hearth as new material was created to replaster the hearth. And here's an example of one of these jamless fireplaces, a hood that would be over the fire, and you could see an example here. This is a more elaborate hood, and the hearth down here, usually with a tile back, but no separate bay to support a wattle and daub chimney. I think that's what we have at Dove's Nest. Not a single Dutch artifact from there. Here we have a Dutchman, no Dutch ceramics, all British, maybe German. We do find other artifacts that may be Dutch. I know, for instance, these tin-glazed tiles. These are tiles that would have been put on one of those jamless fireplaces, but also on surrounds for English-style hearths as well. They're tin glazed just on the front. The back is unglazed. They're about usually 5 inches on the side. And they're often decorated, usually in blue, often with soldiers or, landscapes, occasionally biblical stories. So we find fragments of these on a lot of sites from the colonial era, especially later in the 18th century. They're quite common. But these could just as easily be British made in the London area, aren't necessarily Dutch. Although if we find some with clearly Dutch scenes like windmills, I think we can assume that they're Dutch made. And I know we've got a number of these from the Broadneck Peninsula just north of Annapolis, where we've got several 17th century sites. Glass beads, it could be British made, but most of the thinking is that these are made either in northern Italy, Venice, or in the Netherlands. And I'm not sure, I'm not a specialist in this area. They show up in such small numbers, and they're almost certainly used for trading. Some of them may be for rosary beads too, but they're not a major item, and it's hard to make too much of them. Another interesting type, which could be Dutch or from one of the German states, are roamers. These are the German drinking glasses. They could be quite ornate. And what really distinguishes them for us are these fronts. These are molded pieces of glass that are welded onto the stem of the wine glass while they're still hot. And I know one of the genre paintings I showed you is sort of a squat example of one of these things. Well, here is an example of one of these fronts. And here is Kent Slavin's hand, who's on this online right now with us. He's the one who dug this thing up from a privy at Patuxent Point. Now, we can make the argument that, okay, we have some sort of Dutch or German presence here, but it's not much of a presence. We don't have 20 vessels, we have one. Tobacco pipes are kind of interesting. Some we find on early 17th century sites, mid 17th century sites, have Dutch maker marks on them, so they're clearly Dutch. We don't find a lot of them around here. When we do, they're usually down St. Mary City, Broadneck Peninsula, north of Annapolis, and of course in sites around where Dutch lived, Delaware, eastern Pennsylvania, Jersey, up and down the Hudson River, western Long Island. We do find, you'll see this one on red here, this molded pipe. It has a low relief, a soldier on one side and a woman in a flowing gown on the other. And I know I've talked about this before too. They're usually referred to archaeologists as the pikeman and Minerva pipe bowls, presumably. Well, the guy is a pikeman, he's a soldier holding a pike. The woman on the other side being the goddess Minerva. Well, it's sort of up to interpretation. But certainly when I arrived in Maryland over 30 years ago, for years after, the assumption seemed to be that these were Dutch pipes. But reviewing the literature for sites up in Dutch New York, they weren't finding any of these. Known Dutch sites were not producing these pipes. They were showing up on Canadian, New England sites, but not on Dutch sites, which suggests that they're probably British. We just haven't nailed down who exactly is making them and where they're making them. And of course, there's an assortment of other pipes here, Native American ones, Native American pipes made for Europeans, and then European made pipes smashed with different artifacts from different areas, but none of them suggest as strongly as the Compton assemblage does that we have a really Dutch presence. And I'm going to blind you for a second and skirt up here because I have a slide that's out of order and I wanted to mention briefly here. So here we've got a table. It's done from my dissertation. Well, actually, this isn't a publication. Well done in courier face typeface, I think. So it looks kind of ugly, but we have a list of vessel forms here. And this is for the Compton site. We have 50, I think as I recall, 54 forms, 54 ceramic vessels we can identify by form for that entire site. And 19 of them are Dutch. So roughly 37% of the ceramic assemblage at Compton that we can identify to form, cup, bowl, pipkin, that sort of thing, they're Dutch. And we just, even when we see the occasional Dutch ceramic shirt on a site, we don't see that kind of presence. So I'm going to blind you again for a second. Sorry about that. I'll pay more attention next time. So, question becomes, what are these Dutch pots doing in Maryland Middens? First of all, we have the Maryland Charter of 1632, by which King Charles I gave the land to Lord Baltimore, the first Lord Baltimore, George. And that charter makes it pretty clear that you're not supposed to be trading with other nations. The charter itself, and it's not explicit here, but it embodies certain characteristics that long after the fact, historians have called the theory of mercantilism. And I'm sure all of us learned about this in grade school. I remember having learned about it. Which grade, I don't recall. But in mercantilist theory, which these folks seem to have some grasp of, they were developing, was that it's right and proper for government, usually a monarchical form of government, to regulate trade in the interest of the kingdom. Self-sufficiency is really important. That is, a nation produces everything that it needs and does not rely on other nations. Bits of this we see today, by Americans. And then finally, bullionism, which is the notion that one should avoid shipping precious metals, specifically gold and silver, to other nations. Gold and silver are the backbone of the economy, or so they thought. And gold and silver were really important for basically buying armaments and paying soldiers, which is one of the reasons it was so important to hold on to gold and silver. It was essentially a national security type issue in their minds. So the Charter of Maryland made it I think made it clear. It wasn't terribly clear because people kept violating it all the time, but we were not supposed to be trading with the Dutch, the French, or anybody else. We were supposed to be trading with the English, and because the Calverts were Irish barons, it was okay to trade with Ireland. In 1651, the Parliament passed what are called the Navigation Acts. 1651 was the first one. There were several after that into the early 18th century. And these were really quite clear. You're supposed to be shipping goods from the colonies, raw materials, not manufactured goods. We weren't supposed to be manufacturing. We were supposed to ship raw materials to the mother country, where they would be transformed, manufactured into manufactured goods, which would then be shipped back and sold to us. And that is a mercantilist model for how an economy should work. Colonies supply raw materials, so we don't have to rely on other countries to provide those raw materials. The home country manufactures them, which gives work to people and brings in money, and they're sold for the domestic market. They're shipped back to the colonies for sale, and they're also shipped abroad because that's a way of bringing gold and silver into the kingdom. The other advantage to this is because we were using English and Irish shipping, that meant we had a good, vibrant shipping trade. So we had ships being built, we had sailors getting experience, and that again was a national security issue because those ships and those sailors could be effectively nationalized by the monarch and put into the regular Navy, either to ship supplies for the Army or for the Navy, or to actually engage in naval conflict. The problem with those navigation acts is that during the English Civil Wars of 1641 to 1649, and the subsequent turmoil during Oliver Cromwell's protectorate, there were very few English and Irish ships coming over to the colonies. For those of you who've read some of the work of Jim Dietz, his archaeology up in New England and Small Things Forgotten, he talks about this. He talks about the relative isolation of the New England colonies during this period. Well, it happened in the Chesapeake too. These ships were not coming over. The Dutch, however, who did not embrace a mercantilist model of economy, were more than happy to supply goods and to buy whatever we had, tobacco leaf and even manufactured goods if we had them. And they were willing to supply money, credit on really good terms. So the Dutch merchants filled in that gap during the 1640s and 1650s. There's sort of an example of that here. Here we go. Don't read this, I'll read it to you. This is a statement, a speech by Sir William Berkeley, who was royal governor of Virginia. And the contents of this he also conveyed in similar form to the London Board of Trade, which was in charge of the colonies. And here he's making reference in 1651 to the newly passed Navigation Acts. I quote, "We are forsooth Parliament's slaves, bought with their money, and by consequence ought not to buy or sell, but with those they shall authorize, with a few trifles to cozen us of all for which we toil and labor. Surely, gentlemen, we are more slaves by nature than their power can make us, if we suffer ourselves to be shaken with these paper bullets," a specific reference to the Navigation Act. "We can only fear the Londoners, who are the principal traders, merchants, who would fain bring us to the same poverty wherein the Dutch found and relieved us, would take away the liberty of our consciences and tongues, and our right of giving and selling our goods to whom we please." This is a fascinating statement. This is capitalism. This is people deciding that the market rules. You buy cheap, sell dear, and to whomever is willing to pay. And it's really about money too, not really bartering or anything else. This is Dutch influence. The Dutch were very much a part of developing what we would later call capitalism. And this is the Virginia governor. In fact, his letter to the London Board of Trade all but confesses to him engaging in this practice. Tells them that the colonists are trading with the Dutch because the Brits, the merchants, the London merchants aren't sending over ships not only to supply the colonist needs, but also to buy all the tobacco we're growing. We've got tobacco that's sitting around on wharves for a year or more, waiting for ships to take it away. Not good business. So getting back to this final point here, in 1660, 1661, Parliament, they'd executed King Charles I, chopped his head off. His rest of his family, his sons particularly, fled to France, where they were protected by the French king because they were all Catholics. In 1660-61, Parliament invited Charles II to return and reascend the throne in his father's place. And there are caveats, and really, this is where Parliament really begins to exert its control over the British government as it does today. The monarch is largely a figurehead. Parliament does all the work, makes all the decisions. So Charles returned and remained on the throne until his death in 1685, I think. Once, with the Restoration and relative peace in England and Ireland and Scotland. It's not a Great Britain yet. Scotland and England, although sharing a king with James I, really did not become united until 1707. But the Navy, the English Navy, was finally able to get out there and patrol and install governments and inspectors in the colonies, ensuring that the navigation acts were enforced. And so in the 1660s, we have that increasing enforcement. There's still smuggling going on, but effectively that puts an end to the Dutch efforts. And we also have at least two Anglo-Dutch wars, 1664 and 1674, I don't recall. But the Dutch really lose their foothold in the mid-Atlantic. We all know that English end up taking New York and the other Dutch settlements in that area, and the English crown really controls this part of North America. But there's still smuggling that does go on. One of the things I find interesting about this, that the archaeology we've been doing on this, is that we're looking at the archaeology of smuggling essentially. And we all grown up with this image of the pirate, patch on one eye, peg leg, making odd noises, swinging a sword about. The average pirate probably, rather than trafficking in chests of gold and silver and diamonds and such, really sold fabric and pottery, and tobacco pipes, and pretty mundane domestic goods. That's what piracy was all about. Piracy and smuggling. The great pirates of the 16th and 17th centuries they were, I think, the exceptions. They focused on a particular quarry, which was Spanish galleons, but a lot of piracy and smuggling went on that really just focused on providing day-to-day goods, avoiding customs excises, duties. That's really what it was all about. So anyway, this work continues. There's still a lot to learn about where these Dutch pots show up, trying to date them more precisely, date those deposits more precisely, try to link the individual planters we can identify for those sites. Who's actually involved in this smuggling effort? Is it something individual households are into, or is it this is what's available, that the smuggling, the bringing in these goods happens at a higher level and folks just buy whatever's available? It's pretty clear there's no connection between ethnicity and the kinds of goods people are buying in that sense. We don't have a bunch of naturalized Dutch people buying Dutch goods. We just have folks buying what's probably available on the open market. So anyway, that's, I think, about all I have for this evening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Was there any Dutch habitation at all in the Chesapeake area?
We had a number of Dutch people. If you go through the printed archives of Maryland, which are online now, you'll see reference to a number of Dutch people. Most prominently down St. Mary's City is Van Swearingen, Gerrit van Swearingen, who owned a coffee house in St. Mary's City. It's part of Julie King's dissertation. And there are others. Because it's been so many years, I can't name them all. There aren't a huge number, but I would say that they were the most common ethnic group, more so than French, much more so than Spaniards, and until the early 18th century, more than Scots. Can't say about Irish. So they're a prominent ethnic group in the area, but they're still relatively small proportionally than the English population.
Yeah, Van Swearingen was the Schout of New Amstel, so he was a part of that government who came over once the Duke of York took over New Amstel, which is now Newcastle, Delaware. And Dini Hossa was the governor. He ran off too, leaving his men to hold the fort who suffered. So, I mean, the management took off and came to St. Mary's City for start a new life while leaving their men behind.
Yeah, well, that's why we're managers, you know?
Yeah, so those two. So, I mean, and Augustine Herman had a huge influence in the Chesapeake, and he was Bohemian.
He was
He was a
Bohemian,
Dutch
yeah.
merchant, and he had a warehouse that was excavated in Manhattan. And he came down to New Amstel, which is now in Newcastle, and he had a warehouse there. And then he was negotiating for Peter Stuyvesant with Calvert over here on trying to figure out the boundary line issues and sort that out. And while that wasn't a success, he did do some negotiating for some dealing with trade at that time.
He also made that map we all know of.
Yeah, well, that's because he understood that the people making the decisions here had no clue of geography. They didn't know what they're talking about. And so he figured he'd make some money. So he made a deal with Calvert. You give me New Bohemia and I'll make, or something. It ended up to be New Bohemia, but he made a map for it that we all use today for research. And it was the one map that actually had shoals and navigation issues, features in it that you can actually sail by. So, and then their family married eventually into the Custis family. And so you do kind of have a whole Dutch influence here of merchants that thrived after the British takeover in New York and down here too.
You know, clearly the Dutch influence is much more pronounced in New York, particularly going up the Hudson.
Yeah.
And that persisted for centuries with Dutch Reformed churches and certain Dutch foods and customs and even language. I mean, I grew up, you know, my family, after emigrating to the New World, you know, they all lived in New York City. Well, I grew up saying the Bronx. And people go, what do you mean the Bronx? What's the Bronx? Well, the Bronx, it's a borough of New York. Oh, you mean the Bronx. And with the Bronx is the Dutch name. That's the Dutch family. Yeah, we use the word that we talked about the Jerseys, you know, because it was West and East Jersey. And this is still part of our linguistic patterns. You know, my childhood, which wasn't as long ago as you might think. So really a strong Dutch influence up there. We don't really see that in the Chesapeake.
You see it up there too, also in the architecture and some of the names of places around, kills and things like that.
Right, yeah, kill for creek, you know, like the murder kill.
Yeah.
Right. Schuylkill.
Yeah, Schuylkill, yeah. And there are some, you know, for instance, on the eastern shore, the Skipton Creek, I suspect that's Dutch. I mean, it pops up, but it's infrequent. There just isn't that much of a Dutch influence here. And it may be because we were such a rural society that it would be hard for there to be any kind of strong cultural influence of anybody. I mean, just such a dispersed population throughout much of Maryland, and especially Southern Maryland up until World War II. We're very much a rural society here. So
Yeah.
that was kind of ethnic influence.
I also think that the Dutch hold on the South River, which was the Delaware River, the whole valley was rather weak. And they're always trying, you know, not to get stomped on by the Marylanders, whether it's Lewis or up in Newcastle. There really weren't that many. It was just kind of like an open area. And in fact, that's why the Swedes came up there, because what's his name? The Swedes figured out that, yeah, it's Dutch claim, but really there's nobody there.
Yeah.
And so the whole colony of the Swedes went up to Delaware to settle at Fort Christina, because the Dutch really weren't there to protect it. There really weren't that many of them. So it was rather kind of weak.
So we can distinguish kind of nominal control and maybe control over trade from the larger culture, which could be quite different.
Yeah.
I suspect that's certainly the case. it's certainly the case in southern Maryland too. It becomes a largely separatist and Quaker colony, even though founded and controlled by Catholics.
Yeah.
So at any rate, we need to find more of these sites from the earlier period and look at what kinds of materials are being recovered and see if we could find some patterning in the appearance of certain ceramic types, particularly Dutch, but also Italian from the Pisa area of Italy, Liguria, and French material. Some of that shows up, although that tends to be much earlier, and even some Spanish. Some of these trade routes can be quite far flung. The other European materials, I suspect, show up in such small numbers that they represent personal goods that people have picked up on their travels, rather than representing any kind of sustained trading patterns. But the Dutch material certainly looks like a sustained trading pattern for a certain number of years.
Oh, sure. There's been problems trying to sort it out, because when you have just a sherd, especially the Holland green glaze sherds, because a lot of just the normal daily wear doesn't matter where it's from in Europe. It's pretty similar stuff.
Yeah.
It's just red wear with a glaze, and whether it's a bit of a green glaze or a clear glaze, it's pretty similar unless you get the whole form. That's what you're talking about.
Mm. What I find interesting about all this is we're really looking at the emergence of capitalism as a economic philosophy. It's not any kind of coherent theory that people are promulgating. It's not, well, let's see, we should do it this way because it's a capitalist way rather than the mercantilist way. These are abstract theoretical constructs applied long after the fact. But you could see the emergence of these ideas. The Dutch were really freewheelers. They saw, for them, it wasn't about self-sufficiency and bullionism, it was about trade. If you provide something that somebody wants from one part of the world in exchange for something else that somebody else wants somewhere else, you make your money through trade. And they scored big time. The Dutch had their colonies, but not many. They were mostly about moving stuff around the face of the earth.
Well,
that's how they punched well above their weight. Joanne?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the Jesuits might have had some influence in bringing in some of that Dutch and French ceramics.
I would say
outside of the period of the when the navigation acts weren't actually effective.
I would say the French.
Before that.
The French they have a greater connection with because of Catholicism, with their connections in what is now Belgium, and France, of course. So yeah, there may have been a connection there. There's been a bunch of archaeology done on Jesuit sites and more that's happening now. Laura Mazer from the Catholic University working at St. Francis and some of the other Jesuit sites. Work had been done years ago by Dennis Pogue, Julie King to a lesser extent. So there's data out there. And it's certainly worth looking into. St. Mary's City have got a great deal of archaeology has been done there over the years. The problem with working with some of that earlier stuff is, the folks down at St. Mary's City, they catalog their artifacts, and in their report they say, well, there's X number of Dutch artifact, this and ceramic, and West Country, this, that, but they never tell us in the report, why do you think this is Dutch? And so it makes it hard to use that kind of data, which is one of the things that prompted my original research. Is like, what exactly does Dutch pots look like? And my work is by no means comprehensive. There's probably a wide range of material that remains to be described, but in the paper I published, there are detailed descriptions of what these things look like, what the ceramic paste is like, etc. So that when I say something's Dutch, I could say, it looks like one of these, see Gibb 1994, whatever. So at any rate, it's like most of what we do, we can work with existing material, but really what works best is to go out and get new data, look at it with a fresh eye, piece these things together, identify forms, because form is really important as well as paste, and see where we go with it. And just keep in mind, we're studying something bigger. It's not just about Dutch pots and Maryland middens. It's about the economic system that's developed to what we have today. Any
Yeah,
other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to say one more thing. If you're interested in reading more about New Netherlands and the Dutch culture, don't worry about the book I worked on. Don't read that. Read this one.
We can't
You
see it clear.
that?
I
That's
can't see it
called
clear.
Before Albany. It's why, but it really talks about the Dutch culture interacting with New York, interacting with Native people up there, and it's a really good primer to work with that.
And what is the
it's-
title and author again?
It's Bradley, James Bradley,
Uh-huh.
and it's put out by the museum up there in Albany. That's where I
And
picked it up.
James Bradley, and the title again?
Before Albany.
Okay. Good to know.
Yeah, and it's a really good introduction to New Netherland in the period. Not necessarily the Chesapeake, of course, but to New Netherland. It's really easy. It's nicely illustrated, which I like. So it's a really nice book, and it's
Oh.
quite affordable, or at least it has been. I haven't seen it on Amazon yet. Yeah.
Yeah, if folks are interested in other bibliographic references or to the paper I published, drop me a line. I'd be happy to send you what I've got. Anything else? Well, it's 8:04.
Hey, Jim, I do have a question.
Oh, yeah?
It's really basic, but on the drawings of many of the vessels, and you split them in half, and the left-hand side is more or less a silhouette, where the right-hand side is, more like you're actually looking at the vessel. If you're looking at the right-hand side, they're showing kind of just a solid base that goes all the way around. But if you're looking at the left-hand side, it shows a stubby little leg. So is that stubby little leg like further within the vessel? Is that why we're not seeing it on the other view?
Yeah, I should point out, first of all, when doing these drawings, I did not do them the way they should be done. Normally, the profile goes on the right-hand side. The reconstructed part goes on the left-hand side, because conventionally, that's where the light comes from that creates the shadows. So we could pick one. There's one here. Come on. There we go. So
Well,
this
that
is
one shows
actually
stubby little
first.
legs on both sides.
Yeah.
Some of them didn't.
Yeah, keep in mind that I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And so I'm just kind of, just sort of did this as best I could. This skillet did have 3 legs. And so this is a sectional view of one of those legs, but if we change the perspective a little bit, that section would look a little bit different, because they're just kind of roughly formed by hand and welded on. There's no particular style embodied in these legs, so they're pretty irregular, I guess is the best way to say it.
Maybe I'll get you some other time, because there were a couple of vessels that were on the one side. It didn't show the stubby legs. It just showed a round base.
Maybe the one with the rim, and then one shows the thickness of the rim edge. Like,
Oops.
that's what I
Yeah.
was kind of thinking.
With some of these
Well, that's
images,
closer.
yeah, with an image like this, for instance, when you're looking at the vessel, you can't see this kick up here. But that's the actual. This is the actual profile of the vessel.
Right.
And-
So that's what I was getting at. So what it is, it's further back.
Yeah, this is sort of like the midline, where this is the rounded part closest to the viewer. And it's this part here that I use to project this here. So it's important to draw this profile very carefully, because it becomes really the source material for everything else you see here. I'm also holding the object in my hand and making fine adjustments, but I'm also in a pencil drawing straight lines across some of these little bumps here that helped me create that coordinate. Nowadays, I would do this on a computer. Once you have this outline here, you can have a drafting program do a 360 degree revolution, and it will effectively draw in a nanosecond. It's taken me hours to do. I haven't figured out how to do the handles yet. It's really good at doing symmetrical stuff. So some years ago, I reconstructed a bunch of bottles that way. I didn't do fine drawings like this. I just got the profiles, had the computer revolve it 360 degrees, and now we have a nicely shaped, accurate bottle. So.
That helps, thanks.
Any other questions before I stop sharing? Okay. Well, I'm done. It was good to see you guys. Next month, talking about the archaeology of Southern Maryland railroads, believe it or not, of which there are a number running through the various counties. So we actually even did some excavations at a railroad station, Fisher Station, down near the Calvert County border. So hopefully I will see you all next month.